Are you ready? Hey everyone, this is Jay Wilburn. I am an author of several books and short stories. I will be doing different things on my Twitch channel, and these videos will go on to Patreon, where some of you may be watching this as a post-recording instead of a live stream. One thing that I'm thinking about doing, and I'm going to experiment with today, is actually reading while I edit a story. So in the process of editing a story, I'll let you follow along with that, see how that's working out, and follow that particular process. I'll talk a little bit about the story, why things are there thematically, but then also look at why I'm making particular changes. Now, the story I'm doing today is called Hare's Tale. That's Hare, H-A-R-E, as in a rabbit. It was in an anthology that was sort of doing reverse fairy tales, where it was told from the perspective of the villain or the antagonist from the story. I chose Tortoise and the Hare, and then flipped it to make the hare the protagonist. Other people did different fairy tales. That anthology is actually not out anymore. I was going to do a different story from way earlier on when I first started writing, because I wanted to pick a story that had a lot of things that I would want to change about it. But that story was a little over 7,000 words. This one's a little over 3,000 words. So for a first time out, I thought doing a shorter story might actually be better. The story is going to go up on my Patreon, which again, some of you watching this after it's been live will be seeing it there, and then I'll post this video there as well, so you can kind of see the process I went through editing it before it came through. So again, the story's already been published once, but there's always things that can be changed as you go through. I'm going to switch to a screen that kind of has me up in the corner, and then the story itself in Word will be the majority of the screen. And there'll be a moment where I switch over. I don't have two monitors, so everything appears on the screen as I'm using the one monitor that I have. All right, now let's get the story up. I meant to already have that prepared, but I forgot to get that set up before I started in on it. Give it just a second to appear here as it's loading. I've done a few fairy tale type stories that have appeared in one form or another in various anthologies and stories that I put together for myself in one fashion or another. As we've put those together, some of them could use a little more work. Some of them are straight horror stories, while others are more specifically more into the fantasy realm. You'll kind of see where maybe this one crosses over a little bit. So this is where I would begin. Hare's Tale by Jay Wilburn. Hare burst out from the gate, his body stretched out in the air, showing sinew and rib under his tight skin and white fur. First lines are kind of important. Sometimes you go bold where it sets the whole scene. Sometimes you go quick and short. First, second, third lines can be pretty important. You can also see here that we're kind of trying to get into the action immediately as well. He cursed as he landed off balance. His sliced shoulder stirred the gravel on the road as it ground into his wound. He staggered and regained his feet in full run. Probably nothing there I wouldn't necessarily want to change. He left the shell of the castle behind him as he bounded across open ground. He gritted his protruding front teeth. His pace became uneven as the pain in his shoulder grew. I did this thing for a while where when I had two verbs like protruding front teeth that I would put a comma in between. I've had a lot of editors cut that out. I'm kind of torn on where to have it, so I'm going to actually take it out here. So I won't be using the double or the comma between double adjectives there. Arrows peppered the ground on both sides of him. Hare weaved from side to side to foil their aim as he struggled to get out of their range. He left the trail briefly and then crossed back over. He could not fight the undergrowth for long in his condition. All right, he left the trail briefly and then crossed back over. All right. I'm not sure if that's confusing. What I think I was trying to say was that he left the trail to possibly find somewhere to hide, but he wouldn't be able to fight the undergrowth. So I'm going to leave that the way it is. I might change it for clarity, but at this moment I'm just going to leave that how it is. The cover lay too far away. He could not keep changing direction, which would be his usual weapon on days he was not bleeding through his white fur. Instead of weapon, I'm going to change that to defense. Alright, that would be his usual defense on days he was not bleeding through his white fur. His only remaining options were speed and faith. He could tell he was quickly losing both. That's kind of a juxtaposition there. Again, as I'm editing, this is not to say this is the perfect way to do it. This is kind of the self-edit process. So it's just a matter of how I want to tell the story. If I were publishing it again, I would definitely put it through another professional editor to find mistakes I miss and then also let me know where the story is not working for them. But for my purposes, I kind of like to compare things that don't necessarily go together. So he's talking about weaving to avoid arrows. We talk about speed as an option for defense. But then I compare that to faith, which you wouldn't normally see as a defense. But it kind of gives a different feel for that sentence. Hare's speech came ragged and slurred through his leopard teeth. It's kind of another word for rabbit. Kind of a little high-minded. It might be something I could take out, but I'm going to leave it in. Saliva flew from his lips, not accustomed to speech, and even he could barely make out his own words through his long ears laid back against his skull. I'm going to say with instead of through, because he's not speaking through his ears, he's hearing with his ears. So I'm going to make that change for clarity. I cannot make it. I'm going to change cannot to the, I'm going to change cannot to the contraction can't as soon as my screen decides it's going to respond again. Here I'm kind of trying to break into the action. There's going to be a moment where I'm going to need to do some world building as well. He continued to bound and limp on his failing leg. The arrows, here we go again. The arrows struck the road close to his hide. His speed faltered further, and his faith shrank to the size of a mustard seed, but he continued to run. All right, there probably needs to be a comma at this and because there's two separate ideas connected there, not coordinating conjunction. The gates crashed open against the domed wall of the castle behind him, and the scaly feet of his oppressors thundered on the road in their plodding manner. He felt the vibration of each step of his enemies through the hard ground, through the gravel, and through the pads of his paws. He ran with little energy. He ran with what little energy he had left and what little faith still remained. He ran in fear and in desperation. He ran because the race had just begun. So we break to the next scene. Hare collapsed. His chest heaved against the hard road. Farther from the castle grounds, the road had become cracked and poorly maintained. Here we have farther with an A, which indicates distance. Further, which we used earlier, indicates degree. So in this case, we're talking about distance, so it becomes farther with an A. Farther from the castle grounds, the road had become cracked and poorly maintained. As Hare let his head fall to the pavement, he felt thankful the gravel had been left behind. Numbness traveled down his wounded leg until he felt the slice on his shoulder open again. He could not feel the steps of his oppressors in the ground, but he knew he approached his oppressor, singular this time, in the ground, but he knew he approached behind him. Hare slurred and drooled through the dust in the road. They never give up, never. He could not draw enough air pressed on the hard ground. He allowed his eyes to slide closed, even as he knew it was the greatest mistake he could make. Hare heard his mother's voice echo inside his skull. His ears perked up off his sweaty head into the breeze. He recognized her tone and clear voice immediately, but the blur of his thoughts kept him from understanding the words. He tried to lift his head, but failed. He forced his eyes open, but he only saw shapes and shades. His vision blurred to match his thoughts. Hare peeled his lips back from his teeth. He decided to do what he had always done when he was afraid as a kid. He listened to his mother's voice. Son, lift yourself from the ground. Being tired is no excuse for allowing yourself to die. Hare let his eyes slide closed again. He took one deep breath before returning to shallow breathing. He muttered, "You are not there. I am alone." I'm going to change that to the contraction. You are not there. I'm alone. I might leave that I am just because it has a little more impact, but I'm going to switch to the contractions because we don't tend to speak in high mind when we're injured, even though this might be a fantasy where it would be okay to not use contractions in dialogue. Her voice turned harsh. Even knowing her voice came to him in hallucination, his fur prickled up again, afraid and feared the wrath of his father for having angered her. You are not a leveret any longer, son. You are a Connie now. Again, these are ages for rabbits. Buck up. You decided to defy the scales and to race the shells. Now live with that choice. Up with you, son. Get to the race. Live, son. Live. He groaned and tried to turn his nose into the road. Twisting made his wounds separate, and he screamed the way only rabbits and hares can. I can't do it, mother. I'm not the buck my father was, and he died at the claws and scales of the scales and the wrath of the soulless shell. Again, we're trying to do a little bit of world building here. The rabbit is a mammal. The tortoise is a reptile. And kind of trying to set up a kingdom and a world here where the reptiles are the oppressors and the mammals or the rabbits are the oppressed. He heard a hiss but did not recognize the sound. The road began to vibrate in small booms that built with each impact. He did recognize that sound. The hissing continued, but became the soft shush of his mother. It was not her harsh demand of silence from young whining bunnies. It was the more soothing sound she gave when fears needed her help in subsiding. His fur rested back on his sweaty body as he relaxed. Look at me, son. Open your eyes and look at me a moment, please. Hare obeyed his mother's voice. He lifted his head from the ground with the dust from the road pasted to his fur. He looked to one side across blurry grass and blazing morning sun. The heat had begun to break through the chill of morning dew glistening on the grass. Despite the heat and his sweaty exhaustion, Hare shivered at the sight of the sun he had not seen in years of captivity to the reptile kingdom. So apparently he's been in captivity for a long time as he's now escaped injured. He turned his head slowly to the other side of the road where the wash of sunlight painted over the top of the grass. I'm going to say tops. Over the top of the grass or over the tops of the grass? I'm going to leave it top, over the top of the grass. His vision remained unclear, but he could see the grass had been crushed down in places by feet larger than his own. He shivered again. Sunlight also lit tall poles and flags that snapped and wavered taut on their frames against the light breeze. He squinted but could not make out the familiar crest of the Lizard King or his Testudine overlords, Testudine being another word for tortoises and turtles. The thundering in the ground grew with each impact until Hare now heard it in addition to feeling it in his broken body. The breeze turned into Hare's face, fluttering the lids of his reddened eyes. He wrinkled his nose at the odor it carried. The smell was not from the tortoise or any other reptile oppressor. He recognized the smile from the dungeons that had served as his shadowed home for years. Hare turned his nose down towards his own fur. He smelled his sweat and the iron from his spilled blood, but the urine smell came from somewhere else on the breeze. He lifted his nose to it. It was not reptile. It was distinctly mammal. He couldn't place the creature. It lacked the markers of rabbits or hares. There seemed to be a mix of haired beasts contributing to the waste. He mumbled, "I'm imagining it all in my crazed fear." His mother's disembodied call insisted, "Look at me, son. I need you to see." Hare whined as he had done as a kid, and he added tears to the mat of blood and sweat in his fur. I'm going to leave cannot here. "I cannot see what is not there, mother. You died before father's bones were crushed by the overlords. You were taken by claws, scales, and at the point of a sword. You are not here." I'm going to change that one to the contraction. "You are not here." Reason I might leave the other one as cannot is just emphasis, as he's kind of talking back to the hallucination, the auditory hallucination of his mother. He blinked away the tears, and his vision cleared as he balanced on one good leg and shoulder. "Look and see me, son. You need to look and see me now." Hare turned his eyes back into the sun. He felt its warmth through his pain and exhaustion. He turned back toward the flags and felt his blood run with ice. The white, brown, and black fur stretched by twine over the wooden frames above the matted grass. Through the cold blaze of fear in his mind, Hare recognized the texture of rabbit fur on the hides, but the myriad smell of urine gave him the impression of a dozen haired beasts. Some of them would have been his predators had the tyranny of the reptiles not usurped nature a generation earlier. So this indicates that the reptiles took over at some point in the past, back when mammals were prey and predator to each other instead of all captive to the reptiles. The reptiles collect the urine of their mammal prisoners, and then they use it to tan their skins, one murder at a time, until no creature with hair remains. Now we're kind of indicating there's sort of a genocide going on of the mammals. A short, shrill cry, again, I'm using the comma between adjectives, I'm going to leave it in this case. A short, shrill cry escaped Hare's throat as he staggered to his feet and stumbled sideways in the road, away from the displayed hides curing in the breeze. "All right, I know this, mother," Hare bellowed. "You died long ago. This is not you. Did they do this to you too?" I'm going to put a comma between you and two. Is that what you are? Let's make that your. Oops, don't want to erase the whole sentence. Is that what you're telling me, or are you just shocking me to my feet? Her voice gave no answer as the thunder in the earth grew. He could smell the loose alien flesh of the tortoise over the stolen stew of urine on the skins above him. Hare spoke the words he had heard from his father as the elder buck was being crushed. "Curse the shell." Hare found the will to run. Again, we cut scene again. He left the road once he sped ahead of the tortoise's pace behind him. The hollow grew thick with trees and undergrowth that had once been kept clear. The territory he entered had not been friendly to rabbits in the past, but Hare risked the detour to seek either shelter or aid in his escape. Okay. He knew the dens lay abandoned once he saw the collapsed entrances. Even the cobwebs that stretched and fluttered over the mouths of the openings were abandoned. Hare closed his eyes to focus on smell over unreliable sight. The smell of bear lay so faint in the air that it could be memory or hope over reality. Hare stood alone in their ruins. He gritted his front teeth and allowed the change to come. He knew the pain would be more intense than normal, both because it had been so long and because of his injuries, but he needed his fingers. His fur retracted and exposed naked flesh. The muscle and fat thickened, and he screamed as his wounded shoulder stretched. His ears shrank and shifted to the side of his head as his nose pulled back into his face. His bones crackled and threatened to snap as they transformed. The sounds of the forest dampened, and the smells in the air vanished as Hare lost his lupine powers for the use of fingers. His screams changed from high and shrill to low and guttural. He collapsed naked in the grass and overgrowth outside the bear's forgotten den. The blades of the dry grass itched his exposed skin. He gritted the rows of teeth that ached and felt strange in his mouth. "I have saved the reptiles the trouble of and skinned my own fur." Hare stood slowly on his human legs. The arm below his wounded shoulder hung limp. He used his other hand to hold the trunk of a tree to keep his balance. The bark felt good in his touch, and he missed the feeling. It took him a moment to remember the way the knees and elbows were supposed to bend. He crawled into the den with more trouble in his larger human form. I'm going to take out the comma there. His larger human form. Hare struggled to see in the dark with his human eyes. He felt through the cast aside and broken possessions of the bears. He could not find the needle and thread he sought to close his wound, but he rolled the shattered table and found cloth inside crockery. Hare pulled out strips and bandaged his shoulder. The cloth became wet almost immediately. All right. Here I'm kind of trying to indicate that this world is full of were animals. So apparently the bears, the rabbits, other animals like that are humans that can change into animals and back. And apparently this is a world that has all sorts of creatures of this kind, and that he's not changed back to human for a long time. So again, I'm trying to build sort of a larger world that indicates that there's something more going on here than just reptiles and rabbits not liking each other. Hare dug further until he found a tablecloth to wrap around his waist. I think tablecloth is supposed to be a compound word. Let me see. Yes. Found a tablecloth to wrap around his waist and sandals to strap to his feet, to feet not evolved for running. He crawled back out of the den, coating his skin, skirt, and scant patches of hair with mud. Okay, that makes sense. He heard the growl from the woods before he smelled the danger, and Hare cursed his human senses. He crouched to the ground and peered through the grass behind the den. He saw it moving through the grass just beyond the swampy edge of the trees and water. It lifted its snout to smell him in the distance, and his blood seeped through the bandage. The alligator's slit of an eye rolled in its socket, scanning the grass. Hare could not tell if he had been spotted. The monster's green and brown flesh rippled under its scales. Its back arched and his white belly came into view as it began to transform. So this reptile alligator is transforming into a human as well. Hare took advantage of the blindness of the gator's metamorphosis from reptile to human. Hare felt the white fur tear back through his human flesh. As the alligator took on human characteristics, Hare raced him, shrinking back into rabbit. He closed his eyes as his ears stretched back out to their full length on top of his head. He gritted his teeth until he only felt the single set protruding in the front. I made a sort of analogy there of a race because it's kind of the take on the tortoise and the hare story. Hare turned painfully on his bad shoulder and bounded back toward the road, away from the swamp and the alligator's territory claimed from the perished bears. He did not wait to see if he had won the race from human to animal. He felt the tablecloth. Again, we will make that compound. And save my progress so far. He left the tablecloth, the sandals, and the bloody bandages on the ground outside the vacated bear's den. So again, part of the reason for this scene, before we cut to the next one, was to establish, of course, that they're were animals, to establish that that's probably how they're building castles and things of that nature, that more than just the rabbits have been hurt by whatever this this tyranny is of the reptiles, and also to indicate that other animals have vanished. So the hare's looking for help but not finding any. Hare continued to run up the road until the pavement gave away to battered cobbles. Let's change away to way. Gave way to battered cobbles. He had to watch his landings with each stride closely. Many of the stones had been lifted from the street, leaving deep pits and puddles in Hare's path. The thunderous steps dropped away behind him, but he did not lose them completely. The alligator did not pursue Hare into the road, but Hare knew that other minions of the Lizard King patrolled deep into the countryside, far from the shell of the castle. Now, it might be good for me to capitalize Lizard King, because apparently this is a proper name, but I think it's okay to keep it lowercase, like maybe a general title. Hare saw movement under the porch of a boarded house just off the road. He broke stride and stood ready as he waited for what might come racing out of the shadows for him. Stones from the road had been used to create 3 stacks of steps up to the porch. The stones sat askew. I need a comma here. The stones sat askew, and the boards of the porch split in splinters and rotten patches. The sun beat down hot and brutal from above, preventing him from seeing clearly into the darkness. Hare whispered. I have a period there, but it needs to be a comma. Hare whispered, "I might as well just have my human eyes for all I can see." The creature bounded out from under. Okay, again, we are taking a moment to reload here. With fairy tales, you tend to have multiple encounters along the way. The typical number is 3. So, like if you're following a fairy tale format, and your main character is on a journey somewhere and is having encounters, there's typically going to be 3 encounters. So, you have 3 pigs and the big bad wolf attacks 3 houses before the story is finished. And so that 3 encounter pattern is what's typical for this type of story. You might count him finding the furs curing above the road as 1 encounter, maybe not. The empty dens of the bears would be another one, and then this house would be another. So it just depends on how you count them. But for a typical fairy tale, you'll have 3. I don't know how many I used in this one. Hare whispered, "I might as well just have my human eyes back for all I can see." The creature bounded out from under the porch, as dark as a shadow himself. He tilted his head as he stared at Hare with eyes wide and dark. He spread his wings and let light shine off the barbs of his black feathers. Hare saw light glint brighter off the slender needle in the creature's beak. So we've run into a bird that has a needle. Hare breathed and spoke as clearly as he was able in rabbit form. "If you know mercy or generosity or pity, I need your needle to close my shoulder, Crow." The crow mumbled over the metal clamped in his beak. It is still a crime to provide comfort and assistance to creatures of hair. So again, now we are indicating that there's a law in this kingdom of the reptiles that no one's allowed to help anything with fur, anything with hair. And apparently the birds are exempt from the oppression possibly, but have to follow this law. Hare looked down the road and the remaining cobbles. He sighed. "Sewing my shoulder closed will hardly feel like comfort. Perhaps you could drop the needle and fly away. That would not be assistance in the eyes of the law." Crow called. The needle fell to the dirt. The bird bobbed his head and snatched it back up. I could hear the thunder of the tortoise's approach. I'm certain he would disagree. Birds do not meddle in the business of scales or shells. We do not have a stake in the wars of fur. It's starting to rain outside. I don't know if you can hear that. Hare folded his ears back against his head. It is not a war when we are simply skinned and tanned with our own urine into extinction for the crime of being furry. Once they are done with fur, the Lizard King and his creatures will surely turn to feathers. I've heard that argument before, creature of hair, the crow said, but joining your losing battle will surely hasten your self-fulfilling prophecy against my kind. Your kind should have sued for peace before you needed to sew your shoulder and to flee down pillaged cobbles. All right, so this is touching on a sort of a theme from history that I was trying to incorporate here, maybe, again, a little high-minded for a reverse fairy tale. But the idea that when an oppressive government's going after one group that you're not a part of, it's tempting to be silent because it doesn't involve you. You're not directly a target, and you might make yourself a target by stepping in. But of course, the argument goes that once that group is fully oppressed, then the oppressor is going to move on to the next group, which will include you, and there won't be nobody left around to help. It's a big historic theme, but it might actually have more meaning today with some of the things going on in the news now. Hare bared his teeth. There is no peace to be had when the reptile's only demand is our death. The crow tilted his head toward the sky. Good luck with your race, then, rabbit. The bird took wing and carried the needle up with him. Hare cursed and said, You only want it because it's shiny. He bounded forward, zigging from stone to stone along the cobbles, the process testing his failing shoulder. I might combine those two sentences to make it more grammatically correct, but I think it's fine the way it is. The puddles between stones shook with the impacts of the tortoise moving watery rings from their center to their muddy edges. All right, we skip a scene again. Hare no longer had speed. He just plodded forward in a manner unnatural for rabbits and hares. He pulled his wounded limb up to his chest and hobbled forward without touching it to the road any longer. The heavy pounding of the ground behind him remained loud and no longer fell behind with time. The terrible feet continued to close in on the hare with slow and steady resolve. The cobbles vanished and the road became dirt with deep, ugly ruts. Hare dropped his head and stumbled forward through the wheel tracks. Out of the edge of his vision, okay, that needs to be a comma there. A lot of my editing's just commas at this point, so I apologize, it's not more interesting. Out of the edge of his vision, he could see his wound turning black. He could smell infection setting into it. The ground wavered in his vision with each step of the overlord close behind him. Dust lifted from the road into Hare's eyes and nostrils. He came upon a ravine across the road. He could hear the stream through foliage under him, but he could not see it. The beams of the bridge extended across a short distance to the point where they snapped in an earlier storm and never saw repair. Hare considered jumping. He thought he might survive, but probably not. Hare hissed under his dry throat, That's not what my father did. I don't know if hissed is the good thing. You need an S sound for there to be a hiss. So if a line of dialogue doesn't have an S in it, you don't usually use that. There's an S at the end of that's, so technically it's correct. I typically don't use a lot of dialogue tags, anything other than said. Even when there's a question, I'll still use said instead of asked, because dialogue tags are not meant to be a distraction. If they're noticed, it's probably a problem. In this case, I'm probably going to leave hissed in there just this once. If I see other ones like that where I've declared or pronounced or anything like that instead of said, I would change them. He looked through the field in both directions. The sun dipped low on the western side of the dirt road. In the angled light, Hare could see broken bones of animals being reclaimed by the grasses. He lifted his nose with effort and smelled the air. No odor remained on the bones to identify the creatures that rested in the grasses. A lot of times when you're talking about, like here it says, to identify the creatures that rested in the grasses. If you're talking about a person, it would be the creatures who rested in the grasses. In this case, the creatures are sort of the people. They are were creatures, so they are they have an identity, they have sentience, they have agency. So in this case, you might change it to the line to on the bones to identify the creatures who rested in the grasses. Because it is bones, because it is animals, I may go ahead and still leave it as that. But there is an argument for changing that to who. If it's a person, it should always be who instead of that. If it's an object, it's that. Hare shivered in the falling light. I might put failing light, but I'm going to leave it falling. The quivering of his muscles hurt his shoulder and irritated his other joints. The steps of the tortoise shook the ground hard enough to nearly take Hare off his feet. Another section of bridge collapsed off the wall of the ravine through the tree branches underneath. Hare looked back and saw the elephant-like legs below a shell large enough to serve as the Lizard King's castle. In the story, I've made the tortoise giant, and that's what this scene's supposed to communicate. And it's kind of been hinted at with sort of the thunder of its footsteps landing, almost like it's this giant tank or like a moving castle. its terrible neck stretched up into the sky, ending in an expressionless face. The overlord didn't even bother to look down on his prey. Hare huffed. All right. Again, I'm getting fancy here. This was earlier in my writing, but I'm going to leave it as huffed instead of switching back to said. My computer may glitch out on me in there. Okay, we'll give it a second to get back. I'm going to leave it huffed, even though I feel like now it's better to stick to said most often with dialogue tags. But I'm going to leave huffed in this case. Some of it is that when you're doing fairy tale or fantasy, you can change it up a little bit. So sometimes the language does need to be a little more flowery. Sometimes the speech a little more formal. Hopefully my computer will come back for me here in a second. I think live streaming and having a program open to do editing is working on my laptop, but we'll see how that works out. I wanted to get to this final confrontation too, so that we could see this big moment for the end of the story. Hare huffed, "Do you even have a human form?" And again, he's talking to the tortoise. It's a giant, so it's arguable whether he can change into a human or not. Maybe he's outgrown that, started small and grew into something giant. None of that's specified in the story. Hare took a few steps off the road toward the sun dipping into the trees beyond the ravine. He felt the grass under his 3 feet. He felt it brush his belly. Hare dropped his head and fell to his side. He considered pulling himself to the edge and tumbling down to the finish line cut across the earth, just a single stride away from his body. He might not win the race, but he would deny the tortoise one more kill. Again, I had to have the story end. I kind of have to have the ravine represent the finish line, and then seeing which animal crosses the finish line first. That's not what my father would do. Hare's trying to live up to this legend of his father, who died being crushed by the overlords. Tortoise veered off the road as it closed on the hare in the grass. Hare had bled into his fur and mired it with dirt, dust, and mud, making it unfit for curing. So he's kind of ruined himself for having his hide skinned off and cured the way he saw on the road earlier. The overlord clearly had other intentions for the insolence of the hare, trying to escape and outrun the authority of the scales and shells. Hare's eyes began to slide closed. "I'm sorry, Mother. I tried and I failed. The tortoise's feet found bones hidden in the grass and crushed them into dust as he approached the finish line with excruciating slowness. Her voice whispered back softly, causing... I'm going to put a comma here after softly because we're putting a clause in that refers back to her. Causing Hare's ears to perk one last time. "It's okay, son. You can rest now. We will see you very soon with all your brothers and sisters." So apparently Hare has lost his father, mother, and all his brothers and sisters. The tortoise took his time, placing his foot over Hare's body. Once he had him centered and pinned, Tortoise rested his massive weight, barely feeling the spine snap and the ribs shatter. Hare was too exhausted to scream. The shelled overlord never looked down. He made a slow, wide turn to return to the road and to begin the long journey back to the shell castle. Full darkness set in before the tortoise finished turning and before Hare finished dying. So he's been crushed by this tortoise, but he's still dying. The tortoise's back foot slipped over the finish line. The monstrous reptile did not react with fear. He lifted the leg up slowly to step back on solid ground. The ground crumbled again under his weight, and both his back legs slid off together. The tortoise lowered his long neck to try to lean forward, but he acted too late and too slowly. The wall crumbled, and his massive body tumbled over the finish line, crashing through the trees onto his back. The sharp rock cracked his mighty shell. Hare's vision blurred in the darkness, but he saw the tortoise fall. Hare's body started to transform in response to the pain. His bones slowed their change and stopped expanding in mid-shift. His eyes, his ears, and nose remained. He had too many teeth in his partially changed mouth. Hare groaned as life seeped out of his twisted, broken body. I'm going to leave the comment there. I should have left it in the first sentence if I was going to leave it in the other sentences, so I may have to go back and fix that too. I'll do that after we're done with the stream. The reptile overlord took a very long time to die, as he expired at a slow and steady pace. Hare won the race down to death, even though he never crossed the finish line. Hare's half-human chest hitched as he struggled to breathe his final words, "Cursed the shell." The reptiles wrote the official version of the tale, praising the pace and virtue of the tortoise, but the surviving creatures with Hare kept their own telling in their hidden burrows. As the small mammals snuck out for food under the tyranny of the reptiles, some of the curious or courageous among them would venture out to the finish line to see the last stand of the hare and the hollow victory of the tortoise overlord. In the darkness, they transformed into human shapes to use their fingers. They touched Hare's bones near the line, resting peacefully in the grass. They peered over and saw the trees growing through the tortured shell of the monster. They whispered their secret cry of rebellion spoken by Hare and by his father before him, "Curse the shell." As quickly as the words left their human lips, they regrew their fur and shrank back into their smaller bodies. The mammals scurried back to their hidden homes, dreaming of future days lived in the warmth of the sun. They hoped for lives without hiding or running. They imagined the time when they might give their war cry out loud at the gates of the lizard himself, because Hare had the courage to run his final race in the sunlight of his last day of life and led the deadly monster overlord to his finish line. All right, so that's Hare's tale, according to the way that the animals tell it. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to put it up on my Patreon page for the patrons to enjoy. And if you're watching this on Patreon, you're kind of getting an inside view of editing. Again, it's already been in an anthology, so there wasn't a lot that I changed in this particular version of the story. In future recordings, I'll do stories that are from further back and probably will require a little more editing. There were other changes and story revisions that I could have made to that particular story, but I think it stands on its own there. So I kind of like that, and I hope maybe this video gave some insight into the writing of the story, even though most of the changes I decided to make were commas, and one of them I'm going to go back and change back to the way it was. So again, thank you for listening in on this, and I hope to have you guys watch some videos again in the future. So thank you, and I'll talk to you again soon.